Well, good afternoon and welcome to this May 6th FinXTech Exchange. I'm Al Dominic, the CEO, Bank Director in FinXTech. And on behalf of my colleagues that are all over the United States, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. This Exchange webinar is brought to you by Bank Director and the team at FinXTech. It's also made possible with the help and support of Aperture, HC3, Mantle, and Velocity Solutions. Altogether, we're going to be talking about really how technology can enhance the customer experience. And this is going to be an expert-led webinar followed by an off-the-record peer exchange session. I don't have that many housekeeping notes, but I'll go through them as quick as I can. Many of you have been doing these Zoom and BlueJean webinars now for months, so you're probably familiar with listen-only mode. Everyone has been automatically put into this. So that means you're automatically muted. So don't worry if you make a little bit of noise. We find that for a viewing experience, if you click on the slide bar at the bottom of the screen, you can put the presenters into full screen mode. Some of you might like this, some of you may not, but that's an option that's available to you. We also encourage you to ask questions. And yes, you're in mute mode, but you'll still have the opportunity to click the Q&A button that you can find on the right side of your screen. When you drop that in, that'll come to me. I'm going to do my best to moderate this conversation, and I'll try to put your question in front of our panel of experts as quickly and efficiently as I can. Now, there's no need to take detailed notes, but again, if you want to, you're more than welcome. The recording of this particular webinar is going to be shared with all attendees on bankdirector.com, and typically our team does a great job of posting something within 24 hours. If you have any technical questions, we'll do our best. Use the moderator chat that you can find on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll do our best to take care of it, and we'll just knock on wood that we can troubleshoot anything that comes our way. So those are the housekeeping details. Again, I'm Al Dominic on behalf of Bank Director and FinXTech. Thanks for joining us. I've got some great presenters that are going to be coming on screen. As I say their name and the company they're with, I've asked them to turn on both their video and their microphone. I'm going to start with Mike Boserman, who's the Vice President of Growth at Mantle. Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Matt Ellis is the Chief Revenue Officer at Aperture. He's going to be making an appearance in a moment.
Hi, Al. Good to see you.
Hey,
thanks for having us.
Of course, it's our pleasure. Steve Swanston is the EVP of Sales for Velocity Solutions. Steve, can you come on down?
Hey guys, good to see you.
And we got to get someone who can elevate all this. So Tori Van Cura Rutland, who's the Chief Growth Officer of HC3, is going to round out this killer group. So Tori, hi, how are you?
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon.
So, I thought there's so many different ways that we can approach this conversation. Maybe the easiest is for me to ask each of you to give me some general thoughts on what's taking place right now. I'm going to start with Matt, if that's okay, and really focus on customer expectations as we come out of the pandemic. A lot of folks have gotten their vaccine shots or are in the process of considering those. Seems like the economy is starting to move in positive ways. People are looking out their window. They're seeing the birds chirp and the flowers bloom. The customer expectation, though, over the last 16 months has really changed. Some of those are fleeting. Others are a little bit more permanent. What are you seeing on the permanent side of customer expectations as it relates to the financial sector?
I think the thing, Al, that we're seeing that we don't think is fleeting, we help banks serve their retail and business customers digitally. So the demand to do more digitally, whether that's open accounts or service accounts for consumers or businesses, the demand is up, right? And so we see that. We see it on the web. We see it in mobile. And we see that all over the place. We see banks, shocking to me that, even though my sales teams can't be out on the road in front of customers, we've had record quarters, each of the quarters during the pandemic. So we've found a way to get work done, even though we're not in person. And our banks and credit unions report that their customer demand to be served digitally continues to accelerate. So we certainly and I'm knocking on wood, I certainly hope that that is not a fleeting change, but more of a permanent change. The other comment I'll make is we talk to customers. I know that everyone is looking forward to getting back to face-to-face interactions. I expect in the third and certainly in the fourth quarter, we expect that the trade show business is going to be booming in the United States. We think people are ready to get out of their homes, back into their offices, and back on the road where they can meet their coworkers and their peers.
Yeah, well, as a company that hosts events, I certainly am selfish in thinking that. But as you say it, I'm reminded of a comment by Brian Moynihan several years ago about the value of getting up from your desk and out to see the world with your own eyes. And I think that's been one of the things that's been really a challenge for so many right now, especially when we think about the customer experience. It's had to really shift really fast. And this is a great way for me to take what Matt just said and pivot over to Tori and talk about who can really own the customer experience. And I realize that word own is kind of a dicey one to put. But when we think about the bigger picture of building a strong, successful business model, how would you approach that?
That's a great question. We really see, and I'm going to speak for my organization because we serve the bankers who also were selling them an end user product, which is their customer. And having a clear leadership, whether it's in the marketing department or a client success or consumer group, having a clear customer journey mapped out and a very clear experience across all channels. And that's really key. Matt talked about there's this increase in digital adoption, but there's also people are tired of being at home. So there is still going to be a need for an in-branch experience, telecommunications, any sort of notifications, whether it's, again, a text notification, an email, a document being sent. All of that has to be mapped out and really, really clear and then disseminated throughout the organization. So there can't be a gatekeeper or holder of the knowledge and then it's not fully implemented throughout your entire organization. Where you see companies that are really excelling is everybody is working and rowing in the same direction. I'm going to borrow a little bit from, EOS on that, the entrepreneurial operating system. You have to hold accountability. You can't just have a vision, kind of isolated over here in a corner and not really hold the rest of the organization accountable. And so I see that as the FIs that are doing that, the community banks that are leveraging a really clear consumer journey and empowering their company to take part in that, they're growing faster. They're going to see the most momentum coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah. You talk about momentum. I finally forced myself to get back into a workout routine, and I put myself on a Peloton, and I came up with this next question I want to put to Mike, because there's companies like Peloton that are really pushing the boundaries of the experience that their customers receive. And I'm curious, as I think about what Tori just said, what Matt's already surfaced, are there companies or industries that are pushing the boundaries of the customer experience that you've taken note of and think, wow, that's pretty interesting. I think that might have some applicability in our industry.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And one of the big things that we see with customer experience design generally is that customers' expectations for banking services in particular are driven by the other consumer applications they use. And so whereas most banks often think like they're comparing themselves to other banks from a user experience point of view, actually like what they really need to be comparing themselves to are the big consumer tech companies that are now designing customer experiences that are really compelling. Because these businesses are building up a lot of trust with customers. Like a good example is Google, right? Google has built a lot of products recently for home, Google Home. And I don't know if any of you have used their new Chromecast product. They actually enable you to voice control and find different content from across like every streaming service you could want. And that's totally unrelated to banking. But interestingly, as they start to roll out banking products, all of a sudden customers' idea of what Google can provide from a user experience point of view is incredibly influenced by that. So Peloton's a great example. I don't think they're getting into banking anytime soon, at least hopefully for banks. But Google's a really interesting company from that perspective. They're doing some cool stuff.
Yeah, I think as we get into our conversation, we'll talk a little bit about the information sharing and just being more predictive in your behavior and how you think about your customers' potential interests in trying to pre-position yourself to be there. But before we do that, Steve Swanson's being, kind and probably taking some notes on his own because he's batting cleanup on this. You've heard me ask Matt about the customer, journey and the expectations that coming out of the pandemic. What are you seeing when it comes to some of these shifts? Because, we all are living in this moment where we have different opinions, different perspectives, and you certainly have, some great customers that you've been working with on this very question.
Yeah, no, these guys all touched on a couple of key points. I'll echo a couple of them. To Matt's point, we do think that the second half of this year, we've talked about it quite a bit. We've looked at the crystal ball. Will be a boom for the conference side of things, right? So perhaps business as normal or travel for the sake of travel may take a little while to come back, but I think people are going to be very eager to get out from behind their desk and go see the world and meet. And to Mike's point, from the customer standpoint, our bank clients, and this is one of the things that we stress, need to stop looking necessarily across the street and comparing just to the peer group across the street. It's all about the customer engagement. It's, we talk about how do we bring the customer into the fray and make sure they're engaged constantly with us. It's not a one-time event. And we look at a Peloton and we look at all of the other digital life cycles products that are out there and how those people are engaging their customers. And that's really where the banks that we work with should be looking and really learning from as they go through and they build their own footprint out there in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I appreciate you anchoring our conversation, because when we get into the peer exchange, I think we can dive deeper into all of these these points. Again, I want to offer to anyone who's watching, if you have questions as they come up, drop them into the question box. We'll field them as best we can. But as we're talking, it strikes me that, most all of us just are really addicted to our phones. We're constantly checking, whether it's, the sports score now that, teams are playing, stock prices, what your Bitcoin, account might look like. But mobile has really just become ubiquitous in the way we live our lives. And Matt, I'm curious, how is it that not just a company like Aperture, but institutions are trying to create a more intuitive setup so that their customers are able to really take advantage of the different mobile banking opportunities that are available?
They are, and it's actually fascinating. I think one of the questions that I think folks need to ask themselves, we approach the development of our products from a mobile first perspective. Our logins, actually on a daily basis, almost 70% of our daily logins are people logging in from mobile apps, not from the browser. So the day of, it's that tipping point has long been exceeded. But what we also think is really important is that you understand the transactions your customers are executing on the mobile device, and you optimize the user experience for that transaction set, which is not necessarily the complete transaction set. I know for a while there was a trend that said, well, if we do 100 functions on our website, we got to do the same 100 functions on the mobile app. We don't believe that anymore. We don't think that's the right way to go. And actually, Mike, I thought your point about Google and voice control in Google was really, was totally spot on. I'm a Bank of America customer. I actually worked at one of the banks they acquired. I worked at Bank Boston early in my career. So I still have my primary checking account at Bank of America. And I'm embarrassed to say for the first time last week, while using the mobile app, I actually tried their voice assistant, Erica. There were things that I could do in the mobile app through her, with her assistance, that I could never have found without that voice assistance. So I do think you're spot on, Mike. It's not just how rich is your mobile app. It's a function of how well designed is the mobile app for the transactions the customers expect to execute, and are you really innovating, and are you beginning to add voice interaction with the mobile app? Because I think that's where the industry's heading.
Yeah, and that's interesting because B of A has been pretty vocal about that voice recognition, and Erica building that app out, and I think they've done a really nice job of iterating off of their early rollout, which maybe had a little bit of clunkiness for some of their customers. But what you're saying, Matt, I think it leads nicely for me to ask Mike to maybe expand on what you're putting out there, which is, if you're a community bank, you're not B of A, you don't have the technical resources to throw at some of these challenges and also opportunities. But if you're a community bank, what's the ideal version of the customer experience that you should be considering right now?
So I think the first thing to just address is like, what is the customer experience and how do you even measure what customer ideal outcomes are for that, right? Because I think one of the weird behaviors that I've seen in community banking is to hypothesize that something's a good idea without actually measuring it or asking somebody if it's a good idea. So the first thing I'll say is whenever we talk about a new customer experience, we want to ask the customers, like, what do you think about it, first of all? And then second, we want to look at the data and see how it changes, right? So if we're adding something that we expect to reduce abandonment, we should see reduced abandonment. And interestingly, I think this comes down to time spent as well. So in our research, we see 4 out of 5 customers prefer to manage their finances digitally. So that perfectly mirrors what Matt was talking about. And we also see that 60% of accounts opened on Mantle, we do online for community banks, are opened through a mobile device. And so I think when we're trying to think about like where should community banks be focusing their time, how do they develop an ideal customer experience, even before we get there, it's like how much time are you spending thinking about your digital compared to what your customers are spending with your bank? So a few different challenges there. I think the real place where banks can start to close the gap without having to start invest in some of these more complicated technologies like voice, which I do think is going to be really interesting in the future, is to just focus on the quality of what they do have, right? But trying to cut down the time to open their account, trying to increase the level of automation, trying to decrease the amount of friction that the customer has to go through to open up an account. Those are the types of things that I think are ultimately going to drive at least incremental improvements and get community banks closer to where I think they need to be able to compete with the Chimes of the world and the Chases of the world, who are investing just simply a lot more per dollar of asset.
Yeah, and as you're talking about, how you close the gap between what you're offering today and what customers are going to expect, I think that's a really important strategic exercise to go through to really, benchmark where you are and where you want to be. So I'm curious, could you give this? This just came in, and I want to let Mike take it first, but maybe Matt next. But can you give an example when you're talking about voice assistants, where that application is able to do something that you couldn't do on your own with the mobile phone?
Yeah, so it's often not about like what you can and can't do. It's the ease of doing something. And actually, like voice assistants is an interesting product, and it may work for banking. To Matt's point, his anecdote was interesting because he's found that to be a delightful user experience. But actually, I want to take the reverse side of this, which is sometimes these types of things like pre-fill, for example, ID scanning, things that look really cool and act cool from a tech perspective are not as useful as just simplifying our form. Like we can ask 60 questions and pre-fill them using Verizon and your ID scan and things like that. But a better approach may be to just cut down the number of questions you're asking to 21.
Yeah.
So just a different approach was just to say, yes, there are some very cool things coming down the pipe, but we're always going to examine them from the same point of view, which is what do customers think about this? What's their feedback? How does this change the economic results of the bank? And then ultimately, are there other things from a first principles point of view that we can tackle first that may actually address these issues more effectively? And ultimately, that's, when we're talking about technology, and I think everybody on this panel agrees, driving outcomes is ultimately what matters.
Well, and I think that's where, again, this question I put to you, but I want to bring it back to Matt. It's obviously you got somebody interested. The example of something you couldn't do on your own without the voice assist is the question.
So actually, Al, first of all, great question. And I always love an opportunity to talk more, so that's perfect. I don't know who asked it, but I love it. Interestingly enough, in both cases, so both of the things that impressed me were, so the first one I asked, how can I freeze my debit card? Right? I was in the mobile app and I was trying to figure out, could I do it? I didn't know if I could. So I pushed the Erica button and I said, can I freeze my debit card? And it took me right to the appropriate spot in the application and it let me freeze my debit card. So rather than hunting around an application to find something, and that may speak to the intuitiveness of that UI, that I couldn't find it, but at least they solved the problem by letting me ask the question. The second one was I asked if I could add a cosigner to my account. And again, rather than having me fight with the user interface to try to find that or not find that function, I asked the question, and the answer came back and said, we can help you with that in one of our branches. The closest branch to you is. So in both cases, it was really the thing I liked about it was a respect for my time. They gave me both. They helped me discover the answer with confidence quickly, and I thought that was really powerful.
Well, and that's first of all really helpful just to put real color to the concept itself. It also opens the door for me to turn over to Steve and say what we're talking about is an existing customer relationship. Banks really prize new business. They prize new customer relationships. So I'm thinking about onboarding. And as we talk about the experience that we want to all get to, what should a bank be considering in really the first month, the first 60, 90 days, in that first quarter of activity? How do you think about that onboarding? Because it's really important, but there's got to be some critical points that really start to take shape.
Yeah, that's changed dramatically over the last year, and I'll go back to the points that have been made is kind of the digitization of all of this and that fast forward button on that concept. But you said the word itself, it's activity. It's how do we onboard that new customer, get that customer experience going and really capture the activity. Unfortunately, we still see it. There's a lot of antiquation out there with the onboarding process. Perhaps as simple as still running through an Excel spreadsheet with that 30, 60, 90-day benchmark. Maybe it's a letter, maybe it's a call. We get to the end of that period, and either two things happen: the person became onboarded, or they didn't. And now they slip into what is an inactive account. At the bank, simply sitting there costing money. So it's activity. Before the pandemic, I would say that instant issue was paramount. To get a debit card in the hand of that consumer, obviously the move to online or digital account opening has changed that a little bit. But people open an account for really two reasons. One, they moved, or two, they're disenfranchised with their existing relationship. Most of it coming from the second of that. If you can't get them active immediately through whatever program you're deploying, the chances are they are going to fall back into their old behavior. Tomorrow comes and they're less disenfranchised with a B of A or a Wells Fargo, and the debit card's still sitting in their wallet, and it's easier to pick up that behavior. So from the second that account is opened, we've got to have that level of digital engagement. We have to have some level of incentive to get them to become active, and we have to handhold them through that entire process until we can slowly, over that 60, 90-day period, get them as fundamentally active as possible with us.
Well, let me follow on to that because I was just jotting this down because I think those inactive customers are just as important to discuss as bring on new ones. When you think about where your business comes from, so much of it is existing relationships that can grow. So again, without naming names, but you've got some great banking, customers that are regularly, engaging with these inactive, people. Are there, retention outreach programs that you've seen be successful?
Yeah, Al, that's kind of the holy grail question, right? And I'll tell anybody that's watching. To me, that is the low hanging fruit that's available immediately as soon as you get back to your desk, to your bank. The low-hanging fruit is tapping into those inactive customers. Free checking, for those of us that were around through the heyday of free checking, swarmed the market with checking accounts. So the average consumer has somewhere between 2 and 3, pick what study you want to watch, checking accounts. Well, only one of those, in most cases, is going to be where we're primarily active. And for myself, I have the example. I have a couple of accounts that I acquired along the way because I applied for a loan here or there, but never actually became active in that account. So it just sits there on the books of that bank. And once a year, I get the obligatory letter that says, are you still alive? And what would you like us to do with the $50 that's in this account? And, I kind of test to see if they're going to do anything else. And really, all they would have to do is send me something, perhaps that said, we're going to send you a debit card. If you activate that and swipe it twice in the next month, we're going to do X, Y, and Z for you, right? So you incentivize the behavior with your existing account base. They have worked extremely hard and paid top dollar to get those accounts in the door. And they're sitting there just waiting to be, it's much cheaper to re-onboard an existing account than it is to go out and acquire a new account. So there's a treasure trove of opportunity there for engagement.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing, your personal, experience, because I think it mirrors what a lot of us have, which is multiple, accounts, but really one is the primary, and that's the one that you would, if you were put to the test, say that's my bank right there.
You can only transact it, right? If you're a debit card user, and some are and some aren't, you can really only transact at one primary institution through the debit card channel, because in order to support that, that's where your deposits have to go. And for most instances, you're not typically having, a variety of deposits, so you can have multiple debit cards on the go at one time.
Sure. Now, as we're talking about all this, there's, so many different ways that you can think about banks utilizing technology. For so many, there's a historic reliance on their primary core, technology company. So whether you're a FIS customer, Jack Henry, a Fiserv, I kind of want to put this to you, Tori, and it's sometimes the hot potato, but as we think about the experiences that are being created, is outsourcing with the non-core vendor, if you will, potentially a more creative and financially rewarding experience? And if it is, could you maybe help explain how that's the case?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a little bit of a hot potato. The core is really great at what they do, right? They're really strong at creating that centralized source of truth and that book of products that support NFI. But as our lives and data, and especially transactional data, has become more complex, there are, vendors out there that are really focused and highly skilled in their area. So you've got data analytics, you've got, statement providers, you've got, segmented campaign, you've got lots of different opportunities for those ancillary services that the core, while they might provide a good offering, they might not be as agile or on trend as people that's our bread and butter. So HC3 is in that sort of statement and clear communication of where are you financially, what is your health report. And so for us, that's a very key, we need to be ahead of everybody else. We want to help make our FIs, consumers, financially viable. But going back to that, you have to have that clear customer journey. And you, as an FI, you also have to look at, are you looking for common denominator? I just need somebody to handle X for us, and the core isn't doing X. You've really got to look at what is it you're trying to solve, do your homework on the vendor that could provide that, and what their willingness is to work with other vendors. Because sometimes when you open the door to outsource one piece, you suddenly find that it has a ripple effect and there's some other piece. Like not every bank wants to take on redesigning statements. It's an arduous process, but if they change their online bank vendor, and that was previously maybe with the core, suddenly there's who handles our e-statements. So when you start to pull apart your current core solution, it does kind of create other opportunities to evaluate how vendors can do that. And I do think, going back to the heart of your question, I know I kind of pulled it apart there, that you can become more creative and innovative because you're looking more about the experience and not a boxed product. Here's our out of the box solution. Here's our ancillary solution. From the core, you're looking at, I want to solve for X. I want to create something, and you broaden the conversation. So I think it's definitely a really great opportunity for banks to leverage the latest and greatest technology.
Well, let me press you a little bit on this, because I'm trying to put the business hat on of, okay, we've got now multiple vendors working together to create that more compelling experience, but I can hear the naysayers basically saying, like, all you're doing is complicating some of the internal workflows that we have to do, and that's going to impact our customer, and we don't want our customer to have to take a step backwards as we're trying to do something that's taking us forward. Am I wrong in thinking that, or help me think through that dynamic?
Absolutely. That is probably one of the biggest concerns that we hear from banks and credit unions alike when they're looking to outsource. We already wear a lot of hats. I can't add any more work. So there's two things for, fintech providers to really provide back to the financial institutions. One, that they are going to work with them to create a seamless back office solution, that they're going to help integrate into the core. That's got to be a priority for fintechs. If we're going to win that business and provide a really innovative end user solution, you've got to make it easy on that banker to manage that solution. It's got to be simple for them. They're a consumer as well. They're the same ones out there adopting those banking experiences. That's who you're selling to as a fintech. But two, I think you do have to educate bankers on your experience will change. Your current workflow and your current rituals within your organization, it's going to shift, and that doesn't mean it's going to be harder. Talking about all of that during the scoping out phase and building that project and bringing those vendors in and having those dialogues, you can create a very easy workflow that isn't harder on the banker. But if you don't have those conversations, it's not going to be mapped out well.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to take that and ask Matt to build on it, because, as you nicely shared, Aperture's had some really great success over the pandemic, engaging with people in a digital way. And it strikes me that really the last, 15, 16 months has thrown most businesses, not just the financial ones, into like digital overdrive. So based on what Tori said, how is it that you and, your team at Aperture think about bankers maintaining that personal connection with their customers, even as we become more technologically savvy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought Tori made she made one of her points. I actually took notes as she said it. If you don't buy a particular solution from your core and you elect to buy it from someone else, her comment about different doesn't necessarily, it will be different, but it actually can be better. It doesn't mean it's going to be harder or worse. It can be better and easier. So I thought that was a really important point. But to your direct question, how can bankers make sure that they stay connected with their customers? We obviously, so for us, we are helping bankers by definition engage digitally with their customers, but through engaging digitally with their customers, we give them channels to engage. We do integrated chat. We do co-browsing. So there are a number of technical tools that allow us as a digital provider to let bankers, our customers, bankers and credit union employees, serve their customers and their members, not just by logging in, checking a balance, and doing a bill pay, but if they are stuck, they can send a secure message to a banker, or they can chat with a banker, and the banker can actually get on screen with them and co-browse with them. So technology allows us, let the banker to get closer to their customer and provide differentiated, personalized service. And that's particularly important. Banks, community banks, credit unions, regional banks, that's one of the differentiating value propositions that they have over some of the largest national banks, is that we know you. And as folks have moved to digital, you don't want to lose the we know you value prop.
Well, as Matt, so you're taking notes, I'm taking notes. I'm also getting pinged because, Tori, I warn you, this is a hot potato. Anytime you bring up anything related to the core, you're liable to get a lot of different questions or, can you explain this? So this is really hopefully something that you can help us with. But the question is, how difficult have you found it to capture the necessary data from various core vendors? In your experience, are they cooperating? Do they provide API interface and support? This particular person's experience has been one of nothing but roadblocks trying to work with outside vendors. So that last sentence is not a question, but the first few were. So please help me out.
Yeah, and so I'll say it is challenging. I think that's where you've got to find a good fintech partner that's got some relationships with those cores. Relationships don't always mean that everything's going to move faster, but it does give them a conversation point to kind of help work with you, give you some best practices. So you need advocates with the fintech that you're going to choose. If you're going to use an outside vendor from the core, they need to have some experience and knowledge working with those cores. And not to pick anyone above, because I've worked with all of them through HC3 and our project management team, but with opportunities like Jack Henry, you can become part of that vendor integration program, and that allows you to integrate more easily and work with FIs on that platform. But that doesn't limit access or opportunity with FIS, Fiserv, CSI, all of those. But I would say, and this is something that we've learned, is that your contact at a vendor, they've got to start helping you understand, get a ticket in to start getting data, or to open up that that direct transactional live data coming through. HC3 is we get that bulk data of the statement information once a month. We can also get that transactional stuff coming across like an online bank vendor, but we really use that end of month summary, all of those details, to redesign, display back. So for us, if we don't get data, your project slows down. So I know that is a challenge, but it's part, there has got to be knowledge at the vendor you're looking at. Knowledge doesn't mean that they're going to move faster, right? The core is going to move at their pace. So you've got to have timing. You've got to get tickets in and have that forethought and that plan. So you need an organization that's got a really strong project management system. One of my biggest takeaways in a lot of deal calls is that the project management of a vendor is not being vetted, and that's where things can fall apart. That's where I've seen challenges for everybody, because we're building products, we're scaling quickly. If you don't have a really strong project management team with your vendor, as a bank, probably having a lot of your own internal projects, you're going to suffer. So that's where you can have a great advocate, is in a strong, knowledgeable vendor who can integrate with several, core systems, but you've also got to have a strong project management team that's going to help you through and tell you where you have delays, where you can catch up, where your delays are impacted, but it's not impossible. We've worked with all of the cores. There are challenges. You just need people with vision and drive to move it forward.
Well, Mike,
sort of a don't give up attitude.
Mike, take a sip of water, because I want you to maybe add to what we're hearing right here.
Yeah, look, so she's absolutely right. The project management side of this is crucial. And I think it's interesting for us because Mantle was founded in 2017 and originated as a challenger bank working with Radius Bank as a bank partner. Radius presented to us, hey, your product looks great. Can we use it? I'm like, yeah, sure. First thing they said was, well, can you integrate with our core? I'm like, what? And from there, we have gone on this very long journey of making this a competency of ours that's absolutely crucial. So I think the one thing I would say about this is, for your vendor, they have to take ownership over managing the relationship with the core, making sure that the product works with your core. This has had to be something that we've had to invest in. We have a team within Mantle whose only job it is to manage core integrations. So now we've integrated with all the major cores, or in the process of doing so. And I think my one piece of advice on handling this from a bank perspective is, if you have a vendor that's going to integrate with your core, try to not let them outsource that project. Because if they're using another third party to do it, it just decreases ownership and ultimately can make the timelines a lot riskier. So we try to manage all of our integrations. We do manage us, and I think it's absolutely crucial to success there.
Well, and I'm curious if there's common challenges you've seen community banks face during the implementation phase, and are there things that you've learned help banks to overcome those obstacles? Yeah,
I would say, do you want me to talk from Mantle specific term or from what I hear from banks? Because I'm happy to do either.
Why don't you anonymize it and go from the bank standpoint of what you've heard?
Okay. Yeah, so I often hear from my customer frustration with integrations they've been in the past, where they were presented by a vendor that my product has all of these third parties that's implemented with it. And when they get to the implementation process, they learn that, in fact, actually, no, this costs extra, that wasn't included, this increases the timeline. And so I think, especially as we're adding a lot more third parties into the ecosystem, being really clear with your vendor from a bank perspective and saying, hey, like, first of all, is this third party that you're talking about, Plaid or whatever, included in your pricing or not? And that's a good first question, but actually a better second question is, how many of your customers are using this third party and to what extent? Like, is it working well? Those types of things really help get ahead of some of the biggest issues in implementation. And then on the bank side, the other thing I would say, which we try to give as advice to all of our customers, but I just say to any bank, is if you are trying to implement a game-changing technology or something where you are anticipating a large amount of change at the bank from an outcome perspective, then we cannot make the same decisions or use the same business processes that we did in the past by default. By default, logically, we need to be able to change our process. We need to be open to changing our processes if we want to expect a different result. So typically in our implementation processes, we spend a lot of time with BSA teams, marketing teams, digital teams, deposit operations, just talking about, what are you trying to accomplish? How are you doing that today? What about these options? Do you feel comfortable with this? What about this? And ultimately, the banks that succeed the best with respect to digital account opening spend the most time examining their processes and asking whether what they're doing in the past has worked and whether they would consider doing something different.
Yeah, and so Mike, as you're saying this, we have time for one last question. I want to build off your perspective, and I want to kick this over to Steve. And really, it's all around that same idea of assessing where you are and where you want to be. From your banking client's point of view, do you find them responding and adapting to certain economic trends? I see in the newspaper, banks continue to waive fees. They might have more flexible policies. Certainly there's new product development coming out. What's your take? And that'll probably help us get the peer exchanges, kicked off in a few minutes.
Yeah, you bet. I'll try and give everybody else a chance to comment quickly. But, I used the word macroeconomic shock. And, it tends to be something that is necessary in this industry for there to be a large scale move in one direction or another, because I think fundamentally our industry is fairly slow and cautious to adopt new technology. There's certainly always those early adopters out there. But when you go through something like we've gone through in the last 12 months and you experience the macro shock to the entire system, it forces everybody to reevaluate what they're looking at, how they're looking at, scratch the scoreboard, and how they're doing business in general. So the whole digital experience that they have to be able to run their bank on, what do they need to do to keep their customers engaged? Are they refunding fees? What's their new process and protocol look like? What products do they have to bring to the table? Somebody talked about PPP earlier. That wasn't even a thing last February. And so you have to move quickly into that. Not to mention the challenges that are now coming in from to Mike's point, the challenger banks and the neobanks that are chipping away for that customer base from the outside. So they constantly have to be aware of all of that as they go forth and set the next 6-12 months of strategy.
Yeah. So you can probably tell if you're watching from home that we are just scratching the surface. There's a ton of discussion that we could continue with, but unfortunately we're up against our 2:45 hard stop, and we have that intentionally because we've got our peer exchanges about to start. So before those happen, I want to thank Mike, Tori, Matt, and Steve for their time today. Your perspective is valuable, and it really helps us to understand what's possible. As a reminder, if you're watching, you'll receive the recorded version of this webinar within 24 hours. We'll also post this on bankdirector.com, so we don't have any voice-enabled assistant just yet, but you should be able to find it pretty quick. As I mentioned, the peer exchanges are coming up. These, whether they're done digitally or they're done in person, have been some of the best conversations that I've been a part of. I hope you find it to be just as enriching. This is a great opportunity for one-on-one conversations and to do a deeper dive into some of the topics that we discussed. One thing you should note, these exchanges are exclusive to our bank attendees. So when we talk about it being a peer exchange, it really is, for bankers to better understand the intersection of technology and financial services. If you previously indicated you want to be joining these exchanges, we've broken you into small groups. a unique link was sent to you. That link went out on, I believe, April 28th. And there was another one sent earlier this morning from my colleague, Lucy Taylor. So all you have to do is click on that. It's going to take you right into the peer group. Those start right now. Again, we appreciate you taking the time with us this afternoon, and we look forward to doing this in person at some point in the very near future. Thanks.